Laughter echoed through the lawyer's office as relatives counted their millions, while I stood gripping a mold-covered briefcase that looked like junk. My own mother leaned toward an aunt and whispered that Uncle Harold Crestwick must have lost sanity before dying. But what nobody understood was this: Harold never gave worthless gifts. That briefcase wasn't an insult. It was a trap, a lesson, and a warning. And the moment I uncovered what was hidden inside, the balance of power was about to flip in ways no one in that room could escape. Before I tell how that moment unfolded, do a small favor: stay with this story until the end. Support this story by subscribing to the channel and dropping a comment about where you're watching from. It helps these real moments reach the people who need them most. The office smelled of polished leather and old money. Diplomas lined the wall behind the lawyer's desk, each one silently reminding everyone present that this room decided who mattered next. Papers were stacked neatly, already signed, already accepted. The will had been read. Numbers had been spoken out loud. Smiles had appeared far too quickly. A younger brother sat across the table scrolling through property listings, already planning which coastline suited the new lifestyle best. A cousin leaned back, calculating purchases with the ease of someone who had never worried about rent. Even a teenage daughter tapped messages to friends about a suddenly secure future. And then there was me. 34 years old. Public school history teacher. Hands still faintly smelling of chalk and old textbooks. The only thing placed in front of this seat was a briefcase that looked like it had survived floods, fires, and decades of neglect. Cracked leather. Green mold creeping along one corner. Clasps so corroded they barely opened. Someone laughed out loud. "That's it," came a voice from the far end of the table. "A briefcase?" Another chuckle followed. A few didn't bother hiding it. A mother's hand landed on my shoulder with practiced sympathy. "Harold always had strange taste," came the soft public voice. Relief hid behind the words. Relief that this embarrassment wasn't assigned elsewhere. No one questioned why the person who visited Harold every Sunday for over a decade received nothing that looked valuable. No one questioned why a man mocked for living above a cramped antique shop somehow left behind a fortune that shocked the entire family. No one questioned anything, because everyone believed the story was already finished. But Harold Crestwick never did anything without intent. That truth pressed hard against my chest as fingers wrapped around the briefcase handle. The smell alone made people lean away. Someone suggested throwing it out before mold spread. The lawyer cleared his throat, already preparing to move on. The meeting was over. The inheritance divided. Everyone satisfied. Everyone except the one person Harold had taught how to look twice. That night, the briefcase sat on my kitchen table under harsh white light. Family messages poured in, photos of contracts signed, champagne glasses raised, jokes about vintage trash. Each message tightened something behind the ribs. A spouse stood quietly nearby, watching, not laughing. That silence mattered. "Harold wouldn't do this," came the calm voice from across the table. "Not to you." That sentence stopped everything. Because it was true. Harold Crestwick wasn't poor. Not in spirit. Not in attention. Not in intelligence. 40 years spent in antique restoration meant one thing above all else: nothing passed through Harold's hands without being understood. Sunday visits had never been about charity. They were lessons. How to spot real silver by weight alone. How to date furniture by nail heads. How to listen to objects, not just see them. History wasn't printed. History was held. And Harold never gifted trash. The briefcase opened with a reluctant creak. Inside looked worse than outside. Water-stained lining. Warped leather dividers. Old receipts so brittle they disintegrated at a touch. The smell intensified. Doubt crept in. Had all those years been misread? Had affection been mistaken for importance? The briefcase lid nearly closed forever. Then fingers paused. The lining felt uneven. That was when memory intervened. A voice from years ago in a cluttered shop filled with ticking clocks and dust: "Always trust your hands before your eyes." The back panel was thicker. Stitching darker. Thread newer than the rest. Deliberately hidden. Heart rate changed. The garbage bag was pushed aside. A knife appeared, not for destruction, but for precision. Stitches parted carefully, revealing a slim compartment that no casual observer would ever notice. Inside waited an envelope and something wrapped in oilcloth. Breath stopped. The envelope bore familiar handwriting, tight, deliberate, unmistakable. And in that moment, it became clear: the briefcase was never the inheritance. The briefcase was the key. The envelope trembled between my fingers as oilcloth was peeled back. Inside rested two objects: a small leather-bound journal, no larger than a passport, and a single brass key wrapped in tissue so old it crumbled like dried leaves. The key was warm, as if it had been waiting years for the right hands. The journal opened to a page written in the same careful script I had seen on countless authentication tags in the antique shop. Account 771 to 492, Alpine Federal Vault, Bern. Air seemed to leave the room. This was not sentiment. This was not nostalgia. This was intent. The first pages were notes, dates, references, names crossed out and rewritten. Research. Deep research. The kind only someone patient and obsessive would complete. Harold Crestwick had not collected junk. Harold Crestwick had collected truth. Page after page detailed the life of a man named Elias Morin, a wartime intelligence courier stationed in Switzerland during the final years of the conflict. No spouse. No children. No recorded heirs. Payment records buried in military archives. Assets frozen, then forgotten when the courier died in a so-called accident weeks before filing final reports. The briefcase had belonged to that courier. Purchased at an estate sale decades later for $12. The journal continued. Harold Crestwick had spent 5 years verifying legitimacy, traveling quietly, interviewing archivists, comparing serial numbers, matching signatures. Only after certainty did a single withdrawal occur in the mid-1990s. Enough to buy the antique shop building outright. Enough to invest quietly. Enough to live modestly and let compounding do the rest. The remaining fortune stayed untouched. Waiting. A final letter slipped from the back cover. If this page is being read, then the lesson landed. Most people see only surfaces. This family measures worth by noise and numbers. That is why money went to those who would never look deeper. This went to the one who always did. Chest tightened. This was never punishment. This was alignment. Morning came without sleep. The briefcase traveled to a lawyer's office before family gossip could twist reality further. Documents spread across polished wood. Phone calls crossed oceans. Verification consumed hours. The account existed. The key fit. Ownership was legal. Because the asset had never belonged to the estate. The briefcase had. 2 weeks later, marble floors replaced classroom linoleum. A private room swallowed sound. A steel box slid across a table. Inside waited bearer bonds layered with decades of interest, records preserved with clinical precision, and another letter, this one written by the wartime courier himself. This money was payment for recovered art returned to families stripped of history. If found, use it to protect truth, not ego. $14 million. After taxes. The flight home felt unreal. Hands checked pockets repeatedly, as if paper could vanish through disbelief alone. The family meeting happened the following week. Everyone arrived expecting requests. Assistance. Redistribution. Guilt. The briefcase sat center table. The truth landed without theatrics. Silence replaced laughter. Faces drained of color not from anger, but from realization. The inheritance was never unequal. The inheritance was earned. That day did not end arguments. That day ended entitlement. And this narrator understood something Harold Crestwick had known all along. Money reveals character. Attention reveals wisdom. And the real test is always hidden where only the patient will ever look. By the time the first wire cleared, the world no longer felt solid. Numbers sat on a screen, large, precise, undeniable, but the weight of them pressed harder than any classroom full of restless students ever had. 14 million did not feel like victory. 14 million felt like responsibility with teeth. The briefcase returned home, no longer hidden in a garage corner, but still unopened in front of family. Not out of fear, out of respect. That object had already done its work. What came next had nothing to do with secrets. News traveled faster than expected. A cousin called first. Not congratulations, questions. How long the account existed. Why the lawyer had stayed so quiet. Whether paperwork could be reviewed. An aunt followed. Then another cousin. Each call carried the same tone, polite curiosity wrapped around entitlement. The mother arrived unannounced 3 days later. New jewelry caught afternoon light. Designer perfume filled the living room. A practiced smile formed before eyes could adjust to the sight of the briefcase still resting on the coffee table. So it's true, the mother said softly. All that, from an old case? No denial followed. No explanation either. A pause stretched long enough to expose intention. Family should talk, the mother continued. Especially now. That word, now, said everything. The kitchen table became neutral ground. Coffee sat untouched. The briefcase remained closed. What Uncle Harold wanted, the mother began, was fairness. Silence answered. Fairness, the mother repeated, voice firmer, means recognizing blood. This family. A slow breath steadied nerves trained by years of teenage defiance and historical debates. Uncle Harold recognized effort, came the reply. Time. Attention. Respect. The mother frowned. Visiting an old shop once a week doesn't justify. It justified being seen. That ended the conversation. The mother left without finishing coffee. By evening, messages multiplied. Cousins discussed legal angles. A brother hinted at moral obligations. A distant relative suggested mediation before relationships suffered. Relationships, apparently, existed only when money appeared. The lawyer confirmed what already felt obvious: nothing could be contested. The account predated the estate. The key belonged to the briefcase. The briefcase belonged to the recipient. End of discussion. That should have closed the door. Instead, it opened something else. Students noticed the change first. Not clothing. Not lifestyle. Presence. A different kind of attention entered the classroom. Lessons slowed. Objects replaced slides, old letters, replicas, photographs. History shifted from dates to decisions. From empires to individuals. One afternoon, a student stayed behind. "Why teach this stuff?" the student asked, tapping a faded photograph of factory workers, "if nobody cares?" A memory surfaced: dusty shelves, quiet Sundays, hands tracing wood grain. "Because someone always does," came the answer. Usually the wrong people at first. That night, the decision formed fully. The money would not fix the family. The money would not chase approval. The money would do what Harold Crestwick had always done: preserve what mattered before it vanished. Paperwork followed. A foundation took shape. Not scholarships for prestige. Not donations for names on buildings. Funding went to trades at risk of extinction. Restoration. Conservation. Archival work. Teaching hands to see what eyes missed. Applications poured in quietly. Apprentices. Curators. Young restorers from neighborhoods no one funded anymore. The first award went to a teenager restoring instruments salvaged from burned schools. The second went to a single-parent learning preservation carpentry after factories closed. Each acceptance letter carried the same line: "Value isn't loud. Learn to listen." The family noticed when headlines followed. "Local teacher launches preservation fund." No mention of millions. No mention of Switzerland. Just purpose. That triggered outrage. A brother arrived furious. Accusations flew: waste, betrayal, arrogance. "You think money makes wisdom?" the brother snapped. "No," came the calm reply. "Listening does." The brother left swearing legal action. Nothing came of it. Weeks passed. Then months. The foundation grew. Stories followed. Gratitude replaced noise. The briefcase moved into a climate-controlled case, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Students asked why something so ugly deserved protection. Because everyone else threw it away, came the answer. Winter arrived quietly. On a Sunday morning, flowers rested on a headstone bearing Harold Crestwick's name. Coffee steamed in the cold air. "Lesson received," the narrator whispered. Wind moved through trees like turning pages. And for the first time since the will reading, peace settled fully. Pressure arrived disguised as reconciliation. A formal envelope appeared first: cream paper, embossed seal, legal language wrapped in politeness. Mediation request. Voluntary, of course. Family-centered. Quiet resolution encouraged. The sender, a cousin acting as spokesperson, suddenly empowered, suddenly concerned. The letter claimed misunderstanding. Hurt feelings. Suggested that the foundation looked exclusive, that resources might be better redistributed within the family circle. Translation came easily. Money had not changed loyalty. Money had revealed it. The envelope went unanswered. That silence triggered escalation. A second letter followed, this one from a law firm with a reputation built on intimidation rather than results. Allegations floated carefully: undue influence, mental manipulation, unfair advantage. No accusation strong enough to stand alone. Enough to suggest trouble. The lawyer reviewed everything and laughed once, without humor. Phishing, came the verdict. Nothing more. Still, a choice emerged. Ignore and endure noise. Or respond once, publicly, and end it. The decision took one night. A community event had already been scheduled: first annual presentation of foundation recipients. A modest auditorium. Students, mentors, donors who had quietly contributed after seeing purpose, not headlines. Family received invitations like everyone else. Attendance exceeded expectations. Front rows filled with apprentices holding restored tools. Archivists clutching fragile documents saved from basements and floods. Parents with pride worn openly. The briefcase sat on stage, sealed in glass. The microphone waited. The narrator stepped forward. No anger entered the voice. No bitterness either. Every object on this stage was once ignored, the speech began. Not because value didn't exist, but because value wasn't obvious. Eyes moved toward the case. A family member taught that lesson long before money entered the picture. Not through lectures. Through patience. Silence held. This foundation exists to do one thing: keep skills, stories, and people from being discarded simply because shine faded. Applause followed, not explosive, but sustained. Then the turn. Some believe inheritance is about bloodlines, the narrator continued. Another belief shaped this work, that inheritance is earned through presence. A pause. Visiting when convenient does not build legacy. Showing up when nothing is promised does. Eyes flicked toward the back rows where familiar faces sat stiff, expressions locked. No redistribution will occur, came the calm conclusion. Not because generosity lacks. Because intention matters. The speech ended there. No confrontation. No naming. No defense. The message landed anyway. The following week, legal threats vanished. Calls stopped. Social media posts from relatives shifted tone, from accusation to vague virtue signaling about family unity and moving forward. Moving forward happened without permission. Growth accelerated. Museums partnered quietly. Trades councils reached out. Grants multiplied through matching funds. A letter arrived from a national archive thanking the foundation for saving a collection nearly lost to mold and neglect. A student sent a photograph, first completed restoration, tears visible in the background. That mattered. The past tried one final time. A late-night knock rattled the front door. A brother stood outside, eyes tired, posture defensive. "I didn't know," came the opening line. "About the briefcase. About Switzerland." "No one needed to know," came the reply. Silence stretched. "I could help," the brother offered. "Manage things. Expand." "No," answered gently. The brother swallowed. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The answer arrived without cruelty. "Learn to see what was missed." The door closed softly. Winter deepened. Work continued. The foundation funded a rural workshop training displaced workers in restoration carpentry. Another grant preserved letters from migrant families erased from local records. Each project carried fingerprints of the same principle: value hides where noise isn't. One evening, a student asked about regret. "Doesn't it hurt?" the student asked, "that family turned away?" The answer came after thought. "What hurts is pretending connection exists where effort never lived." Spring followed. At a small ceremony, the briefcase opened publicly for the first time, not to reveal secrets, but to show craftsmanship. Stitching. Hidden seams. Design meant to last. A placard beneath the glass read, "Surface deceives. Attention reveals." Visitors lingered longer than expected. Some cried. Some remembered people overlooked. That was the real inheritance. The moment the truth about the briefcase stopped being private, life shifted in a way that could not be reversed. News did not arrive through headlines at first. News arrived through whispers. Phone calls that ended too quickly. Invitations that suddenly appeared after years of silence. Relatives who had never cared to visit now wanted coffee, dinners, just to talk. The briefcase had done what money always does: it exposed intentions. The narrator understood something important during that week: the inheritance was never the problem. Exposure was. The narrator's mother was the first to arrive unannounced. The front door opened to a familiar perfume and a familiar tone, soft, wounded, carefully chosen. The voice spoke about family. About misunderstandings. About how Uncle Vernon would never want conflict. The narrator listened without interrupting, watching the way eyes kept drifting toward the living room, toward the coffee table, toward the mold-stained briefcase sitting inside a clear protective case. That briefcase had become an anchor. Ugly. Unimpressive. Impossible to ignore. The narrator replied calmly. Family had already received what family believed mattered. Money. Condos. Cars. Applause. The briefcase held something different: responsibility. That answer did not land well. The narrator's brother arrived 2 days later, not alone. A lawyer accompanied the visit, introduced as just a precaution. Legal language filled the room, wrapped in politeness and implied threats. Words like equitable distribution, undue influence, family obligation floated in the air like smoke. The narrator waited. Then the narrator placed copies of the Swiss bank documentation on the table. Not originals. Copies. Enough to confirm reality without surrendering control. Silence followed. The lawyer adjusted posture. The brother's confidence cracked. The argument shifted instantly, from entitlement to strategy. A lawsuit was suggested. A mediation was proposed. A warning followed. The narrator responded with a single sentence learned from Uncle Vernon many years ago. Value only belongs to those who recognize it. The meeting ended quickly after that. Pressure did not stop. Pressure multiplied. Cousins posted passive-aggressive messages online. Family group chats exploded with moral lectures disguised as concern. A distant aunt accused greed. A cousin accused betrayal. A message arrived implying repayment was owed for childhood birthdays, shared holidays, borrowed favors that had never existed. The narrator read everything. The narrator responded to nothing. Behind the noise, real work began. An appointment took place with a compliance attorney specializing in international assets. Every document was reviewed. Every transfer was mapped. Every tax obligation was prepaid. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was rushed. Uncle Vernon had planned for this. The narrator simply followed instructions left behind in careful handwriting. At the same time, another decision formed, quietly, deliberately. The briefcase was never meant to sit in a living room as proof. The briefcase was meant to move forward. The narrator visited vocational schools, historical preservation programs, apprenticeship workshops closing due to lack of funding, places where hands mattered more than pedigree, places Uncle Vernon would have loved. Applications were drafted. Trust structures formed. Scholarships outlined. The foundation took shape not as charity, but as continuation. When the first announcement went public, reactions were immediate. Local papers ran small features. Community boards shared posts. A short interview aired late at night. The narrator spoke plainly. No mention of family conflict. No mention of lawsuits. Only one message repeated. Some people inherit money. Others inherit responsibility. That sentence traveled farther than expected. The family reacted poorly. A formal legal notice arrived one morning, thick envelope, aggressive tone. The lawsuit had been filed. Claims included manipulation, coercion, mental influence. Familiar words. Predictable moves. The narrator felt no panic. Uncle Vernon had prepared for this too. Documents surfaced, dated letters, witness statements, recordings of conversations stored legally and ethically over years. Proof of intention. Proof of clarity. Proof of sound mind. The narrator's attorney smiled for the first time when reviewing the file. Outside pressure intensified. Inside, something settled. For the first time, the narrator understood why the briefcase had been ugly. Why the inheritance had been humiliating. Why laughter had been necessary. The briefcase had filtered everyone. Those who saw trash revealed values. Those who laughed revealed character. Those who walked away revealed priorities. The narrator had not been given money. The narrator had been given truth. And that truth was about to change everything, because the next step would no longer be quiet. The next step would be public. And once the next step happened, no one would ever laugh at the briefcase again. Not ever. Still continuous, no headings inside the story. Part 6. The lawsuit did not stay private for long. Legal filings never do. Within 48 hours of submission, a local journalist discovered the case while scanning probate disputes connected to high-value estates. One curious detail stood out immediately, a wealthy family suing a high school history teacher over a moldy briefcase. That contradiction was irresistible. The first call came from a news desk asking for comment. The narrator declined. The second call came from a different outlet offering to clarify misunderstandings. The narrator declined again. Silence, however, only made the story louder. The headline appeared without permission. Family battles teacher over mysterious briefcase linked to $22 million estate. Phones began ringing nonstop. Parents of former students reached out. Colleagues asked questions in hushed tones. Neighbors slowed cars while passing the house. Curiosity spread faster than facts. The narrator still said nothing. The family, on the other hand, said everything. Statements were released accusing manipulation. Interviews hinted at betrayal. A carefully worded claim suggested that Uncle Vernon had been taken advantage of emotionally. The implication was clear: intelligence without wealth must have meant weakness. That assumption became the family's biggest mistake. The narrator's attorney filed a response, measured, factual, devastating. Included were dated letters written by Uncle Vernon over a span of 15 years. Each letter referenced Sunday visits, conversations, lessons, intent. One letter specifically explained the briefcase decision in unmistakable language. Anyone who laughs at this briefcase has already failed the test. That line appeared verbatim in the legal filing. The internet noticed. A scanned image of the letter leaked within hours. Screenshots spread. Comment sections erupted. Sympathy shifted sharply and publicly. The narrative flipped. Suddenly, the story was no longer about money. The story was about arrogance. Talk shows picked it up. Podcasts dissected it. One viral clip featured a legal analyst explaining how airtight the documentation was, concluding with a sentence that echoed everywhere. This was not inheritance. This was instruction. The family tried to retreat. Attempts were made to settle quietly. Messages arrived offering compromise. Suggestions included splitting funds, dropping foundations, keeping matters within blood. The narrator declined every offer. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. The foundation launched officially 3 weeks later. The Vernon Holbrook Foundation for Preservation and Skilled Trades opened applications nationwide. Scholarships covered tuition, tools, and living expenses. Priority went to students overlooked by traditional systems, restoration, conservation, craftsmanship, history in physical form. Applications flooded in. Stories poured out. Single parents. Former foster youth. Veterans. Teenagers working night shifts to support siblings. People who saw value in things others ignored. The narrator read every application personally. That decision became public too. A reporter asked why. The narrator answered simply, Uncle Vernon never skipped a story. Neither will this foundation. The lawsuit collapsed soon after. Not dramatically. Quietly. Strategically. The family withdrew claims citing personal reasons. No apology followed. No explanation came. Silence returned where entitlement once stood. But silence did not mean peace. The family fractured internally. Accusations flew privately. Blame shifted. The inheritance money that once united suddenly felt smaller. Meanwhile, the briefcase traveled. The narrator brought it to the foundation's first scholarship ceremony. Not polished. Not restored. Still moldy. Still cracked. Still unmistakably ordinary. The narrator placed it on stage. Gasps followed. Then the story was told, not about money, not about lawsuits, not about family, but about attention. About learning to see. About recognizing worth beneath decay. The audience listened differently than the family ever had. Applause followed. Not polite applause. Standing applause. That night, messages arrived from strangers across the country. Teachers. Parents. Students. Curators. Craftspeople. Each message said some version of the same thing. Someone once saw value in me when nobody else did. The narrator finally understood the full scope of Uncle Vernon's plan. The briefcase was never meant to punish the family. The briefcase was meant to find the right hands. And now those hands were building something that could not be undone. But one unresolved thread remained. Because power rarely retreats quietly. And the family had not yet made the last move. The final move did not arrive through lawyers or headlines. The final move arrived through a doorbell. Late afternoon light filled the living room when the sound echoed through the house, firm, deliberate, practiced. Not a visitor uncertain. Not a neighbor curious. This was someone prepared. The narrator opened the door and immediately understood. A parent stood there. Not the gentle kind remembered from childhood. Not the protective kind that worries. This was the version sharpened by loss of control. Expensive coat. Measured breathing. Eyes scanning the house not for warmth, but for leverage. Can a conversation happen without attorneys? Came the question. The narrator stepped aside. The living room offered no luxury. No upgrades. No visible sign of wealth. The moldy briefcase sat in its glass case near the bookshelf, unchanged, unapologetic. The visitor noticed it instantly. Silence stretched. The parent spoke first. This has gone far enough. The narrator remained standing. What happened was unnecessary, the parent continued. Public embarrassment. Court filings. Foundations. Scholarships. This could have been handled quietly. Handled quietly. The phrase landed exactly as expected. Uncle Vernon did handle matters quietly, the narrator replied. For decades. The parent's jaw tightened. You were always sentimental, came the response. That's the problem. Sentiment clouds judgment. The narrator smiled. Sentiment built the fortune being defended, the narrator said. Attention built it. Patience built it. Respect built it. The parent scoffed. That old man hoarded junk. The narrator walked to the display case and placed a hand on the glass. That junk funded everything being spent right now, the narrator said. The vacations. The cars. The silence. The parent stepped closer. Voice lowered. Family should come first. The narrator turned. Family did come first, the narrator said calmly. That's why Uncle Vernon chose carefully. A long pause followed. Then came the truth. Money changes people, the parent said. No, the narrator replied. Money reveals people. The parent's composure cracked, not explosively, but visibly. Control slipped. The voice rose. This foundation, this story, this image you've created, it makes the rest of us look greedy. The narrator nodded. That is not the foundation's responsibility. Silence returned. Finally, the parent asked the only remaining question. What do you want? The narrator answered without hesitation. Nothing. The word stunned more than anger ever could. No control, the narrator continued. No apology. No reconciliation. No validation. The parent stared. The only requirement, the narrator added, is distance. The visit ended without drama. No shouting. No tears. Just the sound of a door closing on expectations that never belonged there in the first place. That evening, the narrator visited Uncle Vernon's grave as usual. Coffee placed carefully. Silence honored respectfully. The narrator spoke softly. The lesson worked. Wind moved through the trees. Nothing answered. Nothing needed to. Months passed. The foundation expanded. Trade schools partnered. Museums collaborated. Apprenticeships formed. Students learned how to restore wood, preserve paper, read history through texture instead of screens. The briefcase became symbolic. Not because of money. Because of choice. Visitors often asked why the briefcase remained unrestored. The narrator always gave the same answer. Because value does not require polish. Family gatherings grew rare. That absence brought peace. The narrator returned to teaching with renewed purpose. Students listened differently now. Lessons carried weight because stories carried proof. Every Sunday, the narrator still visited the grave. Every Sunday, coffee was brought. Every Sunday, gratitude replaced resentment. The inheritance never changed the narrator's life in the way money usually does. The inheritance changed the narrator's vision. And that was exactly what Uncle Vernon intended. Because the greatest legacy was never hidden in a Swiss vault. The greatest legacy was hidden in plain sight. Waiting for someone willing to look deeper. Before you go, if my story made you pause, reflect, or see value differently, support stories like this by subscribing to the channel. Share where you're watching from in the comments so this message reaches others who need it. More true stories are coming, stories about hidden worth, quiet choices, and moments that change everything.